Here on Flow and across the Flow family in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, there is always a running concern about the Darling River system and what's going on with floodplain harvesting, and whether there's irrigators up in that northern part of New South Wales who are stopping water getting down to the lower reaches of the Darling and ultimately into the Murray. And the Menindee Lakes are filling at the moment because there was a huge weather event that brought a lot of rain to northern New South Wales, and that's affected some of the livestock prices that I'll be bringing you later in the program when it comes to agriculture. But that rain has found its way to the lakes and they are filling, and there's also concern in the local community that the lakes will fill to the extent that that water will spill and need to be sent further downstream to South Australia. But that's one of those boom situations off the back of a La Nina weather system. Usually it's a bust situation where those lakes are dry, and there has been a plan in the Murray-Darling Basin planning to actually dry out one of the Menindee Lakes permanently. But the struggles when it comes to the lakes really comes back to whether enough water is actually coming downstream when there are flooding events. The heat about this has developed to the point that local MP Helen Dalton has been leading the charge in encouraging the blocking of new regulations that would allow that harvesting in supposedly emergency circumstances. I'll bring you some comments now from Helen Dalton, local MP for New South Wales seat of Murray.
We worked really hard to explain the situation to those city MPs that don't understand what's going on, because, the water world is very, very hard to sometimes get your head around. So we did a lot of talking, and in the end, I think common sense prevailed. And I did meet with the Water Minister yesterday, and I did say that as a sign of good faith that she actually embargoes floodplain harvesting until the meters are done. Yep. And I think you'd find that most of the storages are full anyway now. They've had a big rain event up there. And it would be only fair and reasonable that subsequent rain that falls is allowed to make its way to the Darling River.
Now, the meters Helen Dalton is talking about are meters to try and measure how much water is actually being taken from the river in that Darling system. I spoke with the New South Wales Irrigators Council, who've got a very different view on exactly what the regulation was meant to achieve.
So there is wide agreement that floodplain harvesting needs to be reduced, licensed and measured, metered. And that's exactly what these regulations did. So it's extremely disappointing after many years and many millions of dollars being spent on technical reports to sort of basically support this reform. It's been 20 years in the making. To see it disallowed yesterday for just basically for political reasons. Has
it been mischaracterised what the regulation was actually about? There were some claims that it was about enabling more floodplain harvesting.
No, quite the opposite. There has been widespread misinformation about what the reform does.
That was Claire Miller, Chief Executive Officer of the New South Wales Irrigators Council. So, notwithstanding the claim that there's been widespread misinformation, the result in the upper house was 21 votes to 15, which includes the Labor opposition and the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party and a number of others. You would have had the coalition of the Nationals and the Liberals lined up on the other side. So it's a real mess, and it needs to be sorted out. If there is a plan to reduce the amount of water being taken, the Irrigators Council, in the full interview you'll be able to hear later on Flow and on the Flow News 24 podcast. In that wider interview, Claire Miller outlines how their legal advice now is that more unregulated floodplain harvesting can occur because the regulation was disallowed, and that theoretically more water would find its way to the Menindee Lakes and down the Darling if this regulation had passed. So we need to get to the bottom of that. We'll be trying to do that on Flow News 24. And let's hope, as Helen Dalton said, common sense will prevail.